I hope that makes sense to you, class. But if ever there's readily available for fair value of a still standing tree, class, then definitely you can use that one. Now moving on as to the treatment now of gains and losses, class, considering that we will have to measure our biological assets at their fair value less cost to sell, we expect that the fair value to change regularly, okay, that it will fluctuate. And because we will have to update the carrying amount, class, to its current fair value, then we expect that there will be changes. And these changes should be reported as a gain or loss. If the fair value increases, that would be a gain. If the fair value decreases, then that would be a loss. Now, an important point of learning here would be to know where will you report the gains or losses from the changes in the fair value, and the answer is it is to be presented as part of your profit or loss. Then some of you might think that's understandable. What else would other students think? When presented with the option, class, that it could be presented in your other comprehensive income, some students would entertain that idea. Okay, but I hope you'll remember the discussion from past one, class, as to the items that will be reported in your other comprehensive income. Gains and losses from biological assets is not one of them. So it would be very easy for you to remember that the gains and losses here would be reported in your statement of profit or loss. Okay. Paragraph 27, class, gives us an example as to why will there be a gain or loss, class, even on initial recognition. A loss may arise on initial recognition of biological asset because costs to sell are deducted in determining fair value less cost to sell. We've mentioned this already earlier. However, a gain may arise, class, on initial recognition of a biological asset, such as when your farm animal gives birth to another biological asset, class. The newly born biological asset, class, would have to be recognized additionally. And because you did not incur any cost, class, the birth of the additional biological asset was a natural course of uh, nature, class. Uh, you will have your assets would increase without any corresponding costs from your part. Okay, another reason, class, for your agricultural produce to have a gain on initial recognition, class, would be when you are harvesting. Now, as to inability to measure fair value reliably, class, again, the rule for agricultural biological assets would be to measure them at fair value. Okay, so what does this require? We must have our fair value. Now, there is a presumption, class, that when we are dealing with biological assets, fair value should be available, class. We are dealing with agricultural products, we're dealing with biological assets. There is definitely a market for these items, and therefore uh, it should not be difficult to uh, determine the fair value that you can use as basis for the subsequent measurement of our biological assets. But just in case, what is your option if indeed you cannot determine the fair value? You will now be allowed to use a variation of the cost model, class, the wherein the cost would be used as the initial basis of the carrying amount of the asset, and you will be allowed to provide allowances for depreciation and impairment. Okay, and that's what will make this weird, class, and some students would forget this because how can you depreciate a plant or an animal, class? So some students would find that hard to imagine that a plant or an animal being depreciated, so they would forget that there is a possible scenario, class, that a biological asset will be measured at its cost less depreciation and impairment, class. But that's very rare, And that's only allowed, class, if on initial recognition you have already claimed that fair value is not readily determinable, class. That fair value cannot be measured reliably. If at initial recognition you have started using fair value, then throughout the life of that biological asset, class, it must be measured at fair value. The presumption, class, there is a presumption that fair value can be measured reliably for a biological asset. And you can only rebut that presumption. You can only claim that you cannot measure reliably the fair value only upon initial recognition. So that when you have started to measure it at fair value already, you cannot just abandon the use of fair value in measuring your biological assets. Okay, so the only instance wherein you are allowed not to use the fair value less cost to sell measurement is only if at the start, class, from the very beginning you already say that fair value cannot be measured reliably. Okay, but in paragraph 32, class, it tells us here that in all cases when we are dealing with agricultural produce, okay, products from our biological assets, okay, there must be a fair value less cost to sell. And that makes sense because at the point of harvest, because you would know as to how much these items can sell. So there should be no problem in determining the fair value when talking about agricultural produce, class. Now, for when you receive biological assets, class, as a result of a grant from the government, class, the issue there is as to when should you recognize an income. Of course, you receive an asset without giving up anything in return. That should be treated as an income on your part. So the question now is, when should you recognize the income from the grant that you receive from the government, class? Okay, and the answer would depend on as to the type of grant that is being given to you. If it's an unconditional government grant, then the moment that the a grant is receivable, then the income, class, and the related assets should be recognized when the grant becomes receivable. Even if you have not yet received it, class, you are already allowed to recognize the asset and the corresponding gain or income by the time the grant becomes receivable, class. But if the grant is conditional, class, you are only allowed to recognize the asset and the related income only when the conditions attaching to the government grant are already met. But that basically is understandable, class, because we use accrual accounting. So for unconditional government grant, we do not wait for us to actually receive the grant before recording the asset and the income because we use accrual. As long as we have already earned it or we have already acquired the right to receive this economic benefit, then asset may already be recognized. The same is still true even for conditional grants, class. Following accrual, you should only recognize an asset and an income only when you have already become entitled to it. And you will only become entitled to a conditional government grant if you have already satisfied or met the conditions attached to the government grant. But as I've mentioned also earlier, class, I believe there's no need for the uh, inclusion of these provisions for biological assets because these are in consonance with the general provisions for government grants as provided in past 20 class. Okay. By the way, if you'll be asked how should a biological asset be presented in the financial statement, should it be presented as a current asset or a non-current asset? Biological assets, class, are non-current assets. Very important. Biological assets are non-current assets. Many students would think that biological assets, when they are thinking lang of fruits, class ba? Since when we're talking about fruits or even for animals, they would think perhaps that's a short-term asset, and that should be recognized as a current asset. That's wrong. The period of benefit we expect our biological assets, class, would go beyond 1 year. Okay, so the general rule for biological assets would be to recognize them as a non-current asset. So to sum up lang, class, make sure to be familiar with the terminologies, class. agricultural activity, biological transformation, harvest, bearer plants, and do not forget the measurement rule, fair value less cost to sell, both for initial and subsequent measurement. Classification or presentation, it is a non-current asset. Where will the gains or losses from the fluctuations in the fair value be reported? It will be reported in your statement of profit or loss. Please be familiar with the uh, related products and agricultural produce to the biological asset. Make sure you're able to find a connection for all of them because you could be asked. Basically, that's it. Although there may be very interesting problems for biological assets class, but as far as theories are concerned, very little things to take note of.